Gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Unveiling the Civil War podcast. I'm here with my friends Dylan Obney and Ben Flowerday. I'm Ben Quina, and welcome everyone to our what is the sixth episode or fifth?
Yeah, episode 6.
Episode 6.
6 now. Moving right along, dudes.
Yes, we are. We appreciate everybody who's tuned in and liked us. Please continue to do that as we move forward. Today we are going to be talking primarily about Civil War reenacting and how we got into the hobby, some of our thoughts and impressions about how some of our initial impressions of the hobby then versus now, just a free-flowing conversation about about our entry into this thing called Civil War reenacting, how we maybe found out about it, those sorts of things. So I'm interested in this conversation a lot, but let's start off with first off, what are you wearing? What are you drinking, Dylan?
How's it going? So yeah, this is going to be a cool conversation. I'm interested to hear how things have changed in so long since you've been doing this over 20 plus years. So it's going to be interesting to hear about that. But yeah, today I just got on my Richmond Depot. It's a logwood dyed RD2. This is actually a Wamba blank that I put together. It's actually crazy how much these things fade. That's just like we were talking about the other day in our Unveiling Jackets podcast. This thing started out as a very like a steel gray blue, and if you can see it now, it's much more greenish gray, starting to fade out to a tan. So I think that's pretty cool. But just another one of the things that totally interests me about this hobby is the changing of the gear. I don't know. I've never been one that can just sit by and rock one impression for 20 years. I do it for a season and I'll get bored and have to change it up. But but yeah, so I'm rocking that today, and then I'm drinking my this is actually an Oktoberfest that I got from Trader Joe's. I forget what brand it is, but some off-brand Oktoberfest I thought I'd give a try.
Forage cap or kepi?
Yeah, this is an earlier model, like forage cap, based kind of on like a McDowell cap. It's got the band here that you can still see, so it's earlier war for sure. But yeah, this is just like one of the first hats I ever got when I started the hobby, and I figured we're talking about getting into it and early times for impressions versus now. I figured it'd be a good time to bust it out. So yeah, I like this one. It's not something I get to wear a whole lot.
All right, Benny.
Yeah, so I'm wearing my frock coat. It's a gray jean wool frock, kind of a steel gray color. It's a little big. I got it when I was about 25 pounds heavier, so it's got that nice loose look to it.
Yeah, you got that Confederate look.
Yeah, exactly. It makes me think there's a picture of like 3 Confederate officers, I think, and they're all wearing frocks, and you can just see their belts like cinch the frocks like right around their waist. That's kind of what this looks like.
Yeah, the belt loops all.
Yeah, it's got and they're like standing there all like with their arms crossed, and the frocks are just huge on them. So
yeah.
we'll call it that. And then I'm wearing my early war Avery Miller kepi. Got another kind of medium gray jean, black band, nice leather brim. It has a chin strap, but I took it off because I needed the buttons for something else. I'll put it back on eventually. But I like this is kind of my early war. It's roughly a 12th South Carolina impression once I get the South Carolina trim on the collar of the frock here. So, and then
I just love the thin stripes. Thin stripes make me happy. Those are cute.
Yeah. About to lose a diamond and a stripe here after this winter, but it's all right. And then I'm drinking, this is a Expedition Stout. It's a Russian Imperial Stout from Bell's Brewery here in Michigan. So
cheers.
How about you, Quina?
Well, I am again, all my gear's put away for the year, and I'm in my work clothes that I just came home for the lunch hour. So I also have some cider with a little bit of rum in it as well. So
is that a Florida cup? What did it say?
That is a Floribama.
Oh, there you go.
Floribama Lounge, one of our favorite places to go when we're in the Alabama. So
ECB.
Been there?
That's good.
Been there? Yeah, it's quite a place.
Yeah, that's interesting for sure.
Yep. Yep. All right. Well, let's start in here. Let's not, limit it to just one person talking for 10 or 15 minutes. Let's have a free flowing conversation. I think,
Sure.
what, if you want to jump in, go right ahead. But um, I began the hobby in spring of 1992. So that would be 31 years ago, 31 and a half years ago.
Not even
And
a thought.
yeah, you guys weren't even born, right?
No,
No, 98.
you're
Right.
98 and I'm 99, right?
Yep.
I was I was 12 years old. The prior year, my parents had taken me to Gettysburg on a trip in Washington, D.C. So we did Gettysburg, Washington, and then we did Appomattox in 1991. And then the following spring, we found out that there was a small living history near our town where I grew up in Western Michigan, and they took me to that event, and we actually met a group, the 12th South Carolina 4th Michigan Volunteer Infantry, and I was absolutely hooked. I was 12 years old. I wanted to do it. I didn't quite grasp the difference between artillery, infantry, cavalry as far as like what that meant for the hobby, but I was soon pretty well convinced I wanted to do infantry. And the group that I joined welcomed me in, said that I could be a drummer boy. They let me borrow their unit's drum. I learned how to do that. I actually ended up taking percussion in middle school later on, and so I kind of did the drum there for a while, with a real emphasis on wanting to carry a rifle. But we had a rule in our group at the time that you had to be 16 to carry a rifle, so I couldn't do that.
How old was it for your group? It was 16.
16 at the time, and I was 12. So I joined. Interestingly enough, the year prior in 91, right after we got back from Gettysburg, the first time I'd been to a battlefield, we went to the Jackson Civil War muster in Michigan, and they did the Battle of Peachtree Creek, Georgia. And there were, a couple thousand reenactors there at the time. And it was a very big event, one of the biggest ones in the Midwest, maybe the biggest one in the Midwest. And we literally, there's a snapshot, a photograph that I have in my family's picture book, that we actually went through the camp of the 12th a full year before I had joined. I actually ended up joining the same unit that we had taken a picture of while we were going through their camp a year before. So that was kind of neat. So I joined. A lot of Vietnam veterans when I joined. A lot of Korean vets and Vietnam vets at the time. A lot of ex-military guys, mostly in their 50s.
Oh wow.
That were, nearing retirement but not quite retired. Most of them were married and had, adult children. Very few younger people, very few my age. I can count on one hand the number of people that were my age at the time.
Like in
And
the whole hobby or just in your group? Saying.
in the Michigan Midwest area, not a lot of younger people.
So when was your first back east event, like big anniversary event?
So this was 1992. So that fall we did the 130th Perryville.
130th. Wow.
And there were 3,000 reenactors.
Nice.
And I remember exactly where we camped. We were federal, and we were camped right up against that hill, that big mountain, that bare open mound. I can picture it now in my head, close to kind of where we parked for the last Perryville. But in any event, that was the first time I did a big national event. And my parents drove me down, dropped me off. They stayed at the Shaker Village, wherever that was, miles away, and set up my A-frame and did the whole thing for the weekend. And that was it. My mom packed me a cooler full of stuff to cook, and my new wrought iron skillet that I got from the Shipshewana flea market, that summer. And I had all the cooking utensils, and I did, I cooked my own food and did my own thing, and with the group that I had joined. But the first time I went to a big Eastern event was the 130th Gettysburg, which was in 93, which was the year after they filmed the movie, and at the very same site where they filmed The Killer Angels. I did not make it down to the Killer Angels that first year in '92 when I joined, because we didn't really know that much about the hobby, and we didn't really know. My dad couldn't get the time off of work, and it was a full week commitment, so I missed that whole August filming of the Killer Angels, which I regret to this day, because it would have been cool to be a part of it.
Yeah, those guys got to camp out there like the whole time, right?
Yep, they camped right out on the field. They bust them into the battlefield to do the filming on the original battlefield, but a lot of it they did on this farm out on Pumping Station Road, which was kitty corner to the place where we held the 150th. If anybody was at the 150th.
My first was the 155th, unfortunately.
So, and then from there, I did the rest of the 130ths, and then we kind of morphed into the 135ths, and that was when the hobby really exploded. The late 90s, mid to late 90s was when the hobby just exploded. There was a great deal of interest in the Civil War. Civil War Journal was on TV. The Ken Burns things was still showing quite frequently. Gettysburg, Andersonville, Glory. I mean, all those things were just. And I think the economy was really good in the late 90s.
Yeah, that too. That's a big part of it. I feel like people were just, there wasn't the best kit available, but whatever was of it, you could buy a brand new Peter Solly musket for, $400.
I got my Enfield rifle for 340.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. And so what was different? What was better? I would say, I was telling Ben this a while back. I would say that the overall knowledge level of the reenactors on an average basis from the Civil War perspective was more back then. But I would say on an individual level, I think there are people now with a lot more expertise in certain areas. So I think back then we were all kind of average, and I include impressions in that as well. If you look at pictures from the early 90s, late 80s, 90s, into the mid 90s, everybody had an average kit. Nobody had a great kit, but nobody had a really, really terrible kit where you looked at them and you're like, oh God, those guys don't look anything like soldiers. I think what you see now is people, the haves and the have-nots. You've got upper level impression people that do a really good job, and you've got on the other end of the spectrum people that just don't have that better impression. And I think that's really the difference. We were all kind of middle class, I would say, back then, to use a phrase from just that we all are familiar with. I would say we were all middle class reenactors back then. Now we have the higher class versus the lower class as far as impressions I'm talking about, not socioeconomic things. But so that would be the difference. And I also think that by and large, the guys that I started with, they were much more avid readers about the war. And I think they knew more about the general flow of the war. Now we have people that don't know as much, but we also have people in the ranks that know a lot about, very specific things that are, really detailed. The units were different. The companies, each unit around Michigan were 30 to 40 men. And so if you got 8 or 9 of them together, you had a regiment. A veteran-sized unit. And so now, not only are there not as many units, the units that are there just don't have the number of men. And I'm talking primarily in the mainstream part of the hobby.
Right. Yeah, that's, I think, a big part of it is like not so much that like I feel like the whole hobby is just sort of making this shift into more, like you were saying, all this higher end kit. Everything's very more focused on the individual soldier and his impression than it is these large battalions fighting one another. Because back in the day, that was like the main thing, where there wasn't as much information, I feel like, about exactly what they would have been wearing down to the exact weaves, like we have today.
We didn't have it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Milstead study didn't even come out until the late 89 or the early 90s.
Well, that was Johnson. Johnson's was 90s.
Jensen, right.
Milstead's, I think, was like 2017 or 16.
Yeah,
or something
exactly.
Like that. So
very.
We didn't have the internet.
And yeah,
that's a big part of it too. Yeah,
I can Google questions about things that you would have had to go to a library or.
Yep.
Yeah.
We didn't, you know, if you had a set of echoes of glory, I mean, I mean, that was huge. But you couldn't just, order them on Amazon. You might find an odd copy at a sutlery or something, for an unconscionable amount of money. But those were not. I don't know. We just didn't have the knowledge, or at least know where to find the knowledge to know what types of uniforms. So you had guys in an Eastern Theater group wearing a Columbus Depot jacket. You had guys in a Western group that would wear Richmond jackets. And because now these are talking primarily mainstream units. I'm not generalizing of all units. I'm just saying generally mainstream units. Back in those days, we didn't have the knowledge base that we have now. But yet I feel that we were very well drilled and very well disciplined. I think where we lacked in some of the authenticity, I think we made up in some of our drill and decorum and numbers, which I think is very impressive. The 135th Gettysburg, there were literally probably 25 to 30,000 reenactors on the field. We put on a full-scale pickets charge, and that's something that has never been done before and won't ever be done again.
Yeah.
I have another
for sure.
I have another comment about not impressions necessarily, but you were talking about people being a little bit more in tune to the war. Can you, since I'm a little jealous, can you speak on how the Civil War as a topic was kind of more a mainstream part of American culture? Like back then you had major stations, you had the Ken Burns series, you had Hollywood movies with Glory and Gettysburg, you had North and South, and just some really big media that in a time of significantly more limited media, you didn't have Netflix and all of this stuff at your fingertips and infinite choices. Like this was being put in front of people's faces on the limited channels that they had.
Yeah,
that probably had to have contributed to some level of the general knowledge base. Like, there are certain movies that I would consider general knowledge for my generation that everyone just quotes here and there. But the Civil War was a bigger part of that.
Right. And so I would say that it was kind of a glory, like a glory years of Civil War remembrance from the mid to late 80s to the early 2000s. I mean, you had Civil War Journal that was on every Saturday morning. And if you were a kid during those years, you'd get up and watch Civil War Journal, and you'd maybe record it on your VHS and watch it again. All those movies were there. But another thing is people read more because they didn't have all these other options. They didn't have YouTube. You couldn't do a podcast. You didn't have anything to satisfy your desire for learning besides reading. I'll say this. I don't have it up here, but James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom won the Pulitzer Prize, I think, in '89. And that was one of my first books. Now, I had no business probably reading that at that point, because I wasn't mentally ready for it. I had Coddington when I was 12, but again, I had no business reading it because I didn't really understand corps and divisions and all this stuff yet. So I was reading that kind of stuff when I was 12, and it was over my head. I had to then back off and start building it from the ground up. And I think the people that I reenacted with, a lot of them were ex-military, and so they had a built-in interest in the war, and so they read about it voraciously and loved to talk about it around the campfire.
Yeah, that's something that definitely you don't see as much anymore at at least mainstream events, is just a general discussion of like just the war, what impression you're doing, what an interesting debating point, just so much. There's so much different stuff to talk about, like we've been doing here. And that's, I agree with you. That's something that most reenactors, at least my age, in their 20s to early 30s, are something that could bring a lot more to the hobby, is just the general knowledge of these guys. Like I feel like we've talked about it, me and Flower Day, about how a lot of reenactors nowadays don't really learn about the war. They just memorize impression guidelines.
Right.
Whereas that's all good and fine that you know exactly what these guys were issued and what they are wearing for this specific thing, but your general knowledge of the war isn't anywhere near, like, you like to talk trash about all these farbs or mainstreamers and stuff, but then you can't even tell me who was in the command, who was at every brigade command at Gettysburg. That was something that people used to discuss wholeheartedly.
Yeah. We never knew the term impression. That was foreign to us. We didn't.
That's funny.
I we
You
the
called it
term.
a uniform, right? Was it
Yeah.
just your uniform?
Yeah. We never talked about impressions. And if we were whether we were going to Bentonville in 1865 or we were going to First Manassas, we pretty much wore the same shell jacket that we bought at Fall Creek Sutlery or Crescent City or if you had Jarnigan, you were here. I mean, a Jarnigan catalog, that was like Christmas. I mean, you'd get that thing and just pour through it, and the
Even
black
up
and
until,
white photos.
even
And
up
they'd send you a piece of paper with all the different cloths and the color that you could choose what your jacket would be. And jean cloth was only like 1 out of 40. I mean, it wasn't that prevalent back then. There was the butternut color, as you know, the brown type, the what they called butternut back then. There was steel gray, there was Richmond gray, there was Tuscaloosa gray. I mean, there was all these types of gray that you could use, and hell, we didn't know. And so we picked what we liked, and that's how we did it.
See, that's something I'm definitely more thankful for, and something I enjoy being a part of, is just this constant new researching of impressions and getting every little detail right. But that's something I also agree that there's just a lot of people that are more focused on that nowadays than they are the actual history of the war. And I mean, even just for myself personally, in the past couple of years, I've made it a point to start reading more. And I mean, in the past 2 years alone, I've learned more about the war than I ever knew before.
I think you need to
from
do
reading
both.
books about it.
I think you need to do both to be a good reenactor. And now that we have the research on the uniforms, I think now we as reenactors need to do a better job getting back to that base knowledge about the war.
And I think that I would say a big reason for that, in my opinion at least, is that a lot of us do this obviously for ourselves first, but there is an element of public education, and at least that we claim. And no offense, but the public doesn't really care about the shade of jean wool that your jacket is, to the extent that we probably do. When they come up and they ask questions, they're not going to ask, oh, well, what textile mills were providing fabric to the Richmond Clothing Bureau in 1863. They're going to be asking questions about the flow of the war, important decisions, factors of
why didn't McClellan attack on the second day at Antietam?
Or even more basic stuff than that, like just series of events. And that's kind of what spurred me to jump in. I would say I'm pretty much in the same boat as Dylan, that for the first 5 or 6 years of the hobby, I was just kind of chugging along. I'd learn here and there, do impression research here and there, but really in the last probably 2 or 3 years is when I've really jumped off the deep end in terms of researching every detail and going into campaigns and battles and command structures. But a lot of that is just because non-reenactors, when they become curious about the Civil War, that's their gateway, is battles and campaigns and commanders, and not buttons and fabrics and linings and regimental returns.
Right.
So
let's we can transition here a bit. What brought you into it, Dylan and Ben? What made you join, and why, and what have you noticed since then, now, changes, if any? Why don't you start, Dylan?
My first interest in the hobby was when I moved to Tennessee when I was 8 or 9 years old. My family moved to Tennessee. We lived in Savannah, which is the town where the Shiloh battle happened.
Yep.
And the very first time, I believe my grandparents took me to the battlefield for the very first time. And we went, I remember seeing the visitor center and seeing they had a display of all the soldiers' personal items, and then a uniform right there, a Columbus Depot jacket, jean wool pants, a pretty mainstream forage cap in the visitor center, but they had all of that for people to just try on, and then you could throw on a pack that they have there, and then there was a haversack with hardtack, a shaving kit, utensils, a plate, a cup, and then I just thought all of that was so interesting. I don't know why, but that's what really grabbed my attention. Was like, man, this is like a person's stuff. This is exactly like what they had to deal with. And then I remember watching the battle, like the movie that they have about the battle there at the visitors center, and just thought it was so wild to see these guys line up shoulder to shoulder and fight like that. And then I realized that I didn't know anything about this whole part of our history, and then that's what like sparked an interest in learning about history for me. And so then after that,
How old were you?
I had to have been 8 or 9 years old, right around there. And then I remember after that, we lived within, you know, 5 minutes of the battlefield. And so I would end up just riding my bike with a neighbor friend of mine, and we would go all the way down to the battlefield and just spend all day there. Every free chance I got, I was at the Shiloh battlefield. And then I saw my first reenactment there, and I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. I remember walking through the camps and being like trying to look inside people's tents and stuff to just see how they were living, and then I realized like, oh wait, people are actually sleeping in there. Like I shouldn't do that. So I just thought that was super cool. And then I tried calling around a few different groups that I found, like researched online, to see if I could join up, but all of them, like anyone that I actually called, said you couldn't join until you were 14. And I was like 8 or 9 or 10 at the time. Flash forward a year, we ended up moving back to California, where I was originally born. And I was super bummed about it, because I thought like, man, California is not going to have any Civil War or anything. That's what I've been mainly into for the past year. And then my dad actually found a reenactment that they have here in Moore Park, California, and we went and checked that out. And that is what used to be the biggest event they had here in California, was at Moore Park. That event would bring like 2,000 combatants to the field, and they advertised it as the largest event west of the Mississippi, and it was true. It really was. And so that was just awesome. I saw that and got a few different groups' contact information, and then just sent out my info to all of them to see if they would let me join. I think I was 11 at this point. And then the first one I heard back from was from my friend Christopher Brezevoy, who now runs Jim Crack and Bunkum, the ammo, bullets, as well as reenactor blanks, all period correct cartridges. Shout out to him. But he started a group here in Southern California known as the 2nd Florida Infantry. And that's one thing that's kind of changed from back then, is a lot of places don't really have like a set unit impression anymore. Like not many people are just the 2nd Florida anymore. They're, more of an organization that branches out and does different impressions. Like, for example, you have the Liberty Rifles, who do all kinds of things, the Liberty Guards that go out and do other impressions. And so that's kind of what I've been working towards. But originally it was just the 2nd Florida Infantry, and we did a mid-war ANV, just a mid-63 Confederate impression, because that's what we could do to basically match the rest of the battalion that we were with. But like we were talking about at the time, at these mainstream events back in, this is 2010 at this point, it was more just about getting everybody in the same stuff, and the best way to do that was through cheaper materials. So I feel like back in the day, you'd get a full company to order a blockade runner issue, and then everybody would have the same frock coat, or everyone would have a shell jacket, and it was much more incremental steps forward. Like I remember when we first started doing Florida, it was like, okay, we're gonna get everybody in a roller buckle or a fork tongue buckle. That was a big thing. And then everybody's going to get a bayonet. That was a big thing, to get everybody to have a bayonet. And then, okay, now everybody's going to have a pack. And there was like a big push to get everybody in the group to do a small change. And that's something that I've seen kind of grow out of it, is this you have this mentality of people that come into the hobby and kind of treat it like a traditional thing where it's like, oh, I show up, this is my uniform, this is what we do at the event, we have the same hijinks around the campfire every time, and then we get drunk and then we go home.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, that's pretty much all the hobby had to offer for them. And I'm glad to see now that it's coming around, kind of like back to what you were saying, more of an actual knowledge of the war, but included in that is a more in-depth knowledge of materials, details of like what buttons they were wearing, what type of jackets, and what theater. And like I remember when I first started getting into taking my impression more seriously and being more campaigner about things, it was like, okay, you're in this group, but not everyone in the group really cares. And you have a couple dudes that look, super on point with their impression, and then other people who don't. And then that was something that kind of bugged me. Yeah, moving forward from that, you just eventually I feel like it weeds itself out. Eventually the hobby becomes too expensive for people to keep doing that same thing, or they find something else that they'd rather be doing. But
Right.
basically, eventually you get left with just the people who are committed to it. And that's something that I've seen change a little bit.
So I have a question about established unit designations that I'll get to later. I don't want to forget it, so help me remind me to ask that question later. But Ben, thoughts on your entry and things that you've seen or noticed?
Yeah, so similar to both of you guys, I was a young kid that it was through, everyone, that's one of the first questions people ask me when they find out that I do this as a hobby. How did you get into it? And then they often assume that my dad or grandpa was really into the Civil War, and I love them, all of my family dearly, but I don't think my dad could tell you what years the Civil War started and ended. Uh, but it was a family trip when I was in probably second grade. We went up to northern Michigan to an old historic fort where they had a cannon demonstration. And as a small 7 or 8 year old child, I saw a cannon go off. I'm like, wow, that's cool. So I started reading about times and places where cannons were relevant. And I was actually first really into the American Revolution. From that, it got me into the Revolutionary War off the bat. And I would read mostly about the Revolution. I would still get books and stuff for Christmas about the Civil War, but it wasn't until a couple of years later that I really transitioned over to the Civil War. And funny enough, it was just because it was a little bit more accessible where I was. Our hometown, little town called Grand Ledge, Michigan, had an annual festival, and one year they brought in some Civil War reenactors, and they had a little skirmish down on the river. And I ran into a buddy of mine from elementary school whose family participated, and I got into it. And so because the Civil War was right in front of me with reenacting, I kind of switched over. I'm like, oh, now I should read about the Civil War. And so that fall, I think I was in fifth grade at the time. So for those of you following, that's around 2010, 2009, 2010. I started getting really into the Civil War. So at the elementary school library, I check out all the Civil War books. I distinctly remember one that I read about, which was a map and a blurb about each of the major battles of the war in chronological order. I cannot for the life of me remember the title. It was probably 200 pages long, black and white, might have been printed in the 50s or 60s. And I renewed that book for like 2 months straight because I was just going through looking at the maps. And that's where I learned about most of the battles outside of Gettysburg. That's where I learned about Shiloh and Antietam and the 7 Days campaign and Spotsylvania and all of that through this book from my elementary school that I was probably the first kid to have checked out since 1992. And it just kind of became hooked. So I actually ended up going out to a couple reenactments with the kid I knew from elementary school. They did it family style. So I did a little bit of civilian, run around with cap guns in half a uniform, half a civilian kit. But I didn't end up sticking. I was just too young. My parents weren't quite ready to leave me out for the weekend when I was 10 or 11. And I had other things going on. I still played sports and had school and extracurriculars and family events. So it never really stuck. But I was still always into the Civil War, still had the toy soldiers, the mini cannons, and all of that. Flash forward a few more years, my 8th grade year in middle school, we did a big Civil War unit, which happened to be 2013, the 150th anniversary of Gettysburg was that year. But I ended up lobbying my teacher to do a bunch of stuff for extra credit. Set up each time we learned about a battle, I would come into class early in the morning and set up these toy soldiers on a big table in the back in arrangement of the battle. So like Fredericksburg, I set them up all behind a wall, all the Confederates behind a wall and the Union guys crossing a river. And that kind of is when it really stuck for me. From then on, I was really, that was one of my hyperfixations. And after my 8th grade year in the summer, we fortuitously moved across the street from some guy named Ben Quina. My family did. And so
Propitious moment.
Yeah, a major turning point in my life. The jury's still out on whether it's a net positive or a net negative. But I introduced myself to Ben when we were a new house, meeting all the neighbors, and Ben was packing up for Jackson, Michigan, which is a local Civil War reenactment. And because I had done some before, I was familiar with the hobby already. I knew that it was the last weekend in August, so I knew he was probably headed to Jackson. So I walk up, I'm like, "Hi, I'm your new neighbor. I'm Ben." He's like, "Oh, I'm also Ben. I'm packing up for a Civil War reenactment right now." I said, "Oh yeah, it's Jackson weekend, isn't it?" And Ben just about turned around and like dropped the bin of clothes that he was holding. He's like, "How do you know that?" And
I was surprised.
Coming with me, kid.
I grabbed him, threw him in the truck, and took him with me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think I said if we weren't literally moving my entire childhood home that weekend, I probably would have gone with you to the event or at least come out for a day. But my parents were not quite keen on that idea. And that was the last one.
Neighbor, he wants me to get in his car with him.
Oh yeah, that almost happened too. So the whole year I go over to Ben's house every, I don't know, a couple times a month, and we talk Civil War. And what did you say? A house fire?
Every couple hours he was over.
Yeah.
Every couple
one time so for a whole year I would go over and talk to Ben, and we were prepping for the next year. I was supposed to do the local drill event, and then it was the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Wilderness. It was the first major event.
All starting to make sense.
Yes. It's all coming together.
Yeah.
So for the drill event, I ended up screwing up my hip and having hip surgery. So I had to miss the spring drill, which meant that my very first event as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed 15-year-old was a national trip to the middle of nowhere, Virginia, to do the Battle of Wilderness. We did it federal that year, portraying the 4th Michigan, but we ended up going out into these woods right on, it's part of the original battlefield.
Yeah.
But they let us build works along this creek bed, sleep out in them Friday night. Really cool camp. I mean, it holds up even today as something that's particularly cool that we did in the hobby. My dad ended up joining last minute for, it's a story for a different time, but he didn't stick with the hobby as much. So since then, I've just kind of only gotten more and more interested in the hobby. When I was in high school and had a lot of other stuff going on, and my parents still wanted me to focus on school, and I played tennis. I was here and there, so I would come out pretty consistently during the summer months between school. I would go to a national event most years that I could, and then I had some just really bad scheduling luck. Like 2 of the coolest events that we as a unit did in that time span. I had high school graduation, and I had to take the ACT test, like just 2 non-negotiable things that I couldn't miss for some events. But since COVID, I've really jumped into both the hobby in terms of making events, as well as reading and getting more involved in the history side of the war. So I look forward now to coming full circle and doing the 160th Wilderness. So that'll be my 10-year anniversary of being in the hobby, doing all the battlefield tours. So yeah, my very first day of touring battlefields was Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. And now that's kind of pretty much my entire personality. So
What a
So
sick.
let me ask each of you this: what was the, if you had to choose one thing, movie, a book, a reenactment, what one thing that got you hooked on the Civil War? What was it? Go, Dylan. One thing.
One thing, it's really hard to narrow
You had to
down.
distill it down to one thing.
It would have been the time I lived in Tennessee. If I hadn't gone and moved to Tennessee and gotten to go to the battlefield as much as I did, that I think is what really started it for me. And then I only expanded on it from there. So like after I really started getting into it is when I remember I picked up a copy of Gettysburg at a flea market with my grandma. We got Gods and Generals and Gettysburg for like 2 for $5 or something at a flea market. And I remember the first time I saw Gettysburg, I don't think I stopped watching it for a week straight.
Right.
I
All right.
love
So
it.
for you, it was being on original ground.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Ben?
So I think if it were one specific piece of media or thing that I had, it was are you familiar with the DK Eyewitness book series, Ben and Dylan?
No.
Okay. Well, they have this whole series of books on, it's like educational books for kids. Do you have one, Dylan? Dylan might have one, but there was one called Eyewitness Civil War, and it was just this book of, and it basically had a bunch of pictures of original items, paintings, and stuff about the Civil War. They have them for everything: World War I, World War II, classic art, the Roman Empire, all of that stuff. But the one that I was given as a Christmas gift by my grandmother, called Civil War, and it was just, I mean, think Echoes of Glory for kids, kind of, but
Okay.
more information about battles.
So
And it
I
was
don't
that
have a
book that
copy
really
of this
got me
book.
into it.
I've heard of those eyewitnesses. I thought I had a copy of it, but this is the first book that anyone ever
I
gave.
have that one. I have that book. Yep, it's got all the activities and stuff in it.
Yes. So this
I
would be
that
the
one.
other thing I'd say is what really got me hooked, because once I got this book, this is when I actually first learned about different battles other than Shiloh. But also, this book is like, it's made for kids, and in the different chapters, there's like 21 different like little activities, like how to make a period correct stretcher, how to
hardtack. How to cook
how to make
hardtack.
hardtack, how to fire, like the firing maneuvers. The very first drill I ever learned was out of this book, and this is what really, like, after this I knew, like, okay, I'm gonna be a reenactor. I'm gonna learn all about this, and that's what really got me hooked.
Okay. That's interesting. I would say, and I'm going to get the book that hooked me up. It's downstairs. I would say that mine was watching the mini series, The Blue and the Gray, with Stacy Keach, John Hammond, Gregory Peck as Abraham Lincoln. That the music, the score, it was today's standards, not very authentic, but I'm telling you, it hooked something in
Is
me.
there battle scenes in that?
Oh yeah, it's lots of battle
Okay,
scenes.
nice.
Yeah. Yeah, you should watch it. So I'll go get that book. But so that's what is that? The Civil War for Kids? I've never seen that one.
Yeah, The Civil War for Kids by James Herbert.
All right, I'll be right back.
It's at my parents' house. If you want to run across and ask my mom for it.
It's, dude, that's so funny. Like,
Yeah,
you told that
I
eyewitness
100.
thing, and I remembered this and was like, oh wow, that is memory unlocked right there.
I was almost gonna say that book too, but really it was the Eyewitness one that got me into it, and then that came later.
Yeah,
I think
talk
I
about
remember.
Echoes of Glory for Kids. This is that, dude.
I think I remember too. Isn't there instructions on like how to make a quasi Civil War uniform with like thrift store, like find a blue blazer and put the
Dude, I'm
buttons
pretty
here
sure
and
that
stuff?
I
Yeah.
remember like getting a bunch of just faux leather from like Joann's and cutting it up into cartridge boxes and stuff, and that was like my first uniform.
So this was the battle cry of freedom.
Nice.
This was the McPherson, the Pulitzer Prize. This was like one of the first books I ever got because it was so big in the late 80s. I was like 9, 10 years old. But I think most people my age and older, the American Heritage History of the Civil War with the great narrative by Bruce Catton. Catton was he was the man for my generation and people that were older than me. I would say that Catton and Shelby Foote and Douglas Southall Freeman, but Catton was everything. He wrote that great book on the Civil War called The Civil War. I've got that somewhere.
I have it. That's
Yep.
I think I have that still from you.
Catton was the man, and I would say that he more than anyone really got me into the literature part of it and the way that he wrote. He was a great writer.
So you're talking, is there a different Civil War by Catton than this?
Yeah,
one?
that's the one right there that Ben's got. I think that's my copy actually.
It is your copy. I've been meaning to get it back to you. You gave this, or you let me borrow this a couple summers ago when I came to you and said I wanted to get more into the war. So
he did that one before the trilogy that he did.
Well, there's also the Army of the Potomac trilogy, which I've got somewhere over there, but those are different than the Civil War.
But that's different than this one. This one's the Coming Fury, and then there's the Coming Fury, then Terrible Swift Sword, and then Never Call Retreat is the trilogy series I'm talking about. I don't know if that's.
I think that's the. Let me see here. It's been a while. The Army of the Potomac trilogy that I'm referring to is Mr. Lincoln's Army, Glory Road, and Stillness at Appomattox.
Oh, okay.
Now that's a trilogy that's basically based on the Army of the Potomac and kind of the ongoings of the political, between the Army of the Potomac's High Command in Washington. And Catton, who was a journalist who knew kind of about the inner workings of Washington, he wrote these, and he was great. So I would say The Blue and the Gray did it for me, along with some of Catton's work and that American Heritage History of the War from a pictorial standpoint.
Yeah, we were talking
bird's eye maps of the troops, that you could watch, and they had them. It was like a colorized with the little troop movements on there. That was kind of neat. And of course, Ken Burns series was huge for me and my generation. It was absolutely huge. And I find it's sad to me that more reenactors don't avail themselves of that series. I think Ken Burns did a good job threading the needle on that. But a lot of reenactors today don't know about it and don't watch it.
I watched it marathon style a few weeks ago, actually. 8 hours straight.
Nice.
Yeah.
I usually throw it on before an event just to get myself amped up.
Just out of curiosity, no one's mentioned it yet, but do either of you guys remember the History Channel series Civil War Combat?
Awesome.
Yeah.
I love that one.
They're all on YouTube now.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Which one is your favorite?
I like the Chancellorsville one.
I like that one. I like the Franklin one.
I bet Dylan likes the Shiloh one.
Yep. That's what I was about to say. The Shiloh one was always my favorite growing up. It's so funny to me because I don't know, like I grew up really like my first couple years of the war, experience with the war, all I really focused on was Grant and Johnston and Beauregard, and like I knew all about the Western theater and didn't really know much about Lee and Gettysburg, or like I knew that I pretty much, my extent of knowledge of the ANV when I first got into it was that Lee fought in Gettysburg, and that was it.
Oh, so that kind of makes sense because you're kind of a Johnston kind of guy, aren't you?
Hey, what do you mean by that?
Well, you've been pretty
at Johnston.
I don't like useless slaughter. Let's put it that way.
But you love retreating. I mean, he must love giving up ground. I mean, because that was what Johnston was all
If
about.
it saves manpower, I'm for it. All right.
He would love Johnston.
The hell with Tennessee. We need more.
Yeah, who needs Chattanooga? Let's just give it up. Atlanta, we'll just
Hey,
let
if
it
it
go without a
wasn't,
fight.
I blame Hood for really the whole Atlanta campaign because no,
What?
if our best chance was at Rocky Face Ridge, Hood pulled out without orders to pull out from Rocky Face Ridge, and then by the time Johnston knew about it, it's like, well, I can't put them back there now because now they're marching into an assault uphill. He messed that whole thing up, not Johnston.
Okay, if I can see that point, what about the other 90 days of the campaign?
No, we don't talk about those days.
Ooh,
Hey, he put
I
up
don't
a
know.
hell of a fight at Kennesaw.
Yeah, I guess.
He
I guess
said Johnston.
I don't, I don't, but that makes sense why you're kind of a Johnston kind of guy.
Hey, listen, he had a decent plan in the beginning. He just stuck with it for too long.
Yeah, I don't know, but it's an interesting cast of characters out west. You know, Davis, whenever he didn't like someone, they just were banished to the west. Just go out to the west.
Well, that might explain a little bit of why things got so messed up out there.
If you were really bad, you went to the Trans-Mississippi.
I think
Yeah,
a
exactly.
good title of a book about the First Corps in fall of '63 would just be like Longstreet's Timeout.
I tend to think that the time apart for Lee and Longstreet was productive. I think they both had an opportunity to kind of calm the jets and kind of
Lee calmed down the army, and Longstreet screwed
found
up
out
Knoxville.
yeah, exactly.
Found out that
Lost
he was-
Realized that he couldn't handle.
That's another thing.
independence.
You're kind of a Longstreet guy too, aren't you? I mean, our first time that we spoke around a campfire was about James Longstreet.
I've since opened my eyes to some new opinions on Longstreet in
Yeah.
general. I mean, I think it's easy. Like we were talking the very first time about how it was the cool thing to be a Longstreet
It's
attacker
easy.
at the very beginning, but now it's more the cool thing to be a Longstreet defender.
Right.
But I think if you really look at it, there were some serious problems at Gettysburg. Mainly, I'd say Gettysburg is my main problems with Longstreet. Then going down into Atlanta, things get a little bit weird when he tries to go to Knoxville. I'd say I'm more of a Johnston guy than I am a Longstreet guy.
Interesting. Okay.
But I remember one of the first things we were talking about was the importance of Little Round Top as some would define as a key to the battlefield. And that was one of the big arguments I had for Longstreet was that in recognizing an importance of Little Round Top rather than completely dismissing it all for Culp's Hill. That's one. I don't know. It gets dicey because he just handled so many things so poorly at Gettysburg. It's just so.
How far we've come since July when we first met around a campfire in southern Pennsylvania.
Hey, things will change, man. Like we were saying,
But let me say this, that conversation around the campfire that night at the 160th, that's the kind of stuff we used to talk about a lot more. And to me, those are the fun things to talk about.
I had a great time doing that because it's not often you get to actually talk to someone with this level of knowledge around the campfire anymore. It's something that I've been missing for most of my reenacting days, other than, a select handful of people. But like you're saying, back in the day, that's kind of used to be the whole point of going out there was go out there, talk, hey, check this out. I just read this, or I just learned this, or that was a cool thing for me to do. And it's kind of what sparked this whole thing was all of us realized like, hey, we all love talking about this stuff, and let's just talk about it and record it and put it out there for people who maybe are also into talking about it or hearing about it.
Here's a question to pose to all of you. So we each started in and have maintained our allegiance to, I guess I would say, units that primarily portray a designation. Dylan, 2nd Florida, we do the 12th South Carolina. Do you think that paradigm, that model is still valid in today's reenacting? Or do you think that that we should change and just simply be whoever at whatever event we're at? I guess the question I would pose. Ben, I'll let you go first.
Yes, that's an interesting question. That's something that I've thought about quite a bit. I think there's pros and cons to each. A pro, though, I think, is by giving yourself a unit designation, you kind of give yourself a home team to root for and an area that you can always gravitate towards for, meaning, authenticity. If you're stuck about something, you can be like, all right, well, what was the 12th doing? Because 12 South Carolina. On the flip side, I think that let's not flip yet. I think that too, it can help with people get into the war who weren't as knowledgeable about it, or who are finding a good starting place. So for instance, for me, I learned a lot about the campaigns of the Army of Northern Virginia first through the context of the 12th, through talking to you and reading, and always having something that was relevant to the 12th. I don't think that having a unit designation is a bad thing at all, but I do like the ability to remain flexible, because if we go to Missionary Ridge, the 12th South Carolina, obviously being in the ANV, was not anywhere near Missionary Ridge. So I think having a unit designation is good for historical purposes and for giving people a focus. I know a lot of people just describe them as pet units, but a lot of people have pet units. But I don't think that it's a good idea to limit your impression to one specific unit and just say, well, I'm in the 12th South Carolina, therefore I have a South Carolina frock and a kepi, because that's what there's one record of them being issued, and that's what you wear to everything. I've seen that mentality with some people, where they're like, oh, we're in this Texas unit or this Alabama unit, and they were issued this at this time, and then they wear that for everything and say, well, it's because our unit wore them. It's like, yeah, but time and place. So
you're advocating for, you think that specific unit designations are a good thing, so long as they're not used exclusively. You kind of want a hybrid approach.
Yeah, which I think at least our unit has been fairly good at doing. My only concern, and I use the word concern loosely, is that sometimes within the context of the modern hobby, I hope it doesn't undermine credibility to say, like, oh, we're an authentic organization, the 12th South Carolina, and then have people be like, no, all the authentic organizations have cool names like the Gray Rifles or the Wilmington Blues or something that doesn't have a unit designation. So I don't know.
What about you, Dylan? What are your thoughts?
It's a touchy subject. I've been on the side of doing a single unit impression I did that for 11 years ish, where we were solely the 2nd Florida, and that's all we ever did. It's different out here in California, where the mainstream events are, there's nowadays it's, 4 or 5 different companies, where it's really just a group of guys that are still trying to live out this unit that they created in the 80s. They're trying to just keep it going and keep it going and keep it. It's just like beating a dead horse at this point. And I'm really, in the last couple years, like we turned what was the 2nd Florida into more of a think tank group of campaigners called the Independent Western Rifles, where we try to do different immersive, authentic events for us, not involving the public, just going out to a location and then finding a specific time and place in the war where we can accurately portray a certain aspect of it. So, for example, now we do our winter quarters event, where we portray the 27th Virginia in winter quarters during 62 to 63. We have a California miner event where we portray gold mining in 1863, where gold miners in the Central Coast were fighting against the Paiute natives in the area. And so we could try to more focus nowadays on doing those things and using the mainstream events as a chance to recruit people into the hobby, because that's the only time you're really going to interact with the public. So I do think it's important to go to those events still. And if you're going to go to those events, then you need just a unit designation. And so you might as well stick with the one that most of your guys know already. Um, but that being said, if I had it my way, if I was running the mainstream events, the entirety of the group that shows up there would portray one company. Because in reality, that's the total number of guys that we're getting. We could make it look so much better with just one set impression. Everyone shows up and we're just, the second Minnesota or the
Yeah,
24th Georgia or whatever it may be.
we've run into that. We've run into that same issue here in the Midwest where we've got several units that have been around for a long time, including ours. But most of them can't field anywhere near 30 people or 40. And so, they're down to under 10. And so but they still, are the whatever, unit. And I think it's difficult because five guys don't make a company.
Exactly.
Um,
You just
really,
see those guys just running around still trying to do the same thing that they were doing in the 80s. And
right.
that's one of the things that I'm trying to get away from, more or less. I
That's
think really,
that's where a devotion to a unit, I think, can get
Negative.
a negative thing. Yeah.
Because
it
and
becomes
truthfully too,
detrimental.
for us in here in Michigan at least, like we're in the 12 South Carolina unit. I don't think anyone in the unit is from South Carolina. None of us. I would never introduce myself as a South Carolinian to anyone.
Right.
Even when people ask, like, "Oh, who are you guys?" I'm like, "Oh, we're portraying troops from South Carolina."
Got my charger.
I've heard people that are reenactors introduce themselves and or describe themselves as from the state of their unit that they portray, and it's like, oh well, we Mississippians have to stick together. It's like, you're from Lansing, Michigan. You're not a Mississippian,
Right.
and no offense, but that's, I think, adopting regional pride from a time 160 years ago for a region that you do not live in is where things get a little bit hairy. Will I admit that I'm really interested in South Carolina and even South Carolinian units outside of the 12th, kind of because of their proximity and culture? Yeah, like I like reading after the 12th. I like Kershaw's brigade. I like reading about the South Carolinians in the Western Theater, but I would never say, oh well, I'm a South Carolinian. And
yeah, it is a problem. So I think what I'm hearing is that unit designations can be a positive thing, but if they're taken too far, whereby we're really not able to put the numbers on the field or put the product out there, then that's really not a good thing and is counterproductive to what we as reenactors should do.
That, and I think too, refusing to work with other groups, like by saying, oh well, I'm a Georgian, so I need to keep my Georgians together. Like, let's be real here. We're reenactors. That state pride thing isn't what we're here for.
There's always been a lot of turf wars in the hobby, even going way back. I mean, politics in the hobby has always been prevalent. I remember in the days before the internet, there was this publication called the Camp Chase Gazette, and there was a counter publication called Reenactors Journal. And in those publications, there would be letters to the editor, and so some battalion commander would write in about something that the other battalion commander did to tick him off, and the next month that other battalion commander would write in, and they'd go back and forth, and it was like it was Facebook basically, just every other month a response. But there's always been these interesting regional loyalties, these interesting turf wars that have been around forever, which I find interesting and very clannish. And when I mean that, I mean like these units are like families almost, and you don't want to go outside your family for fear of you know, you don't want to go outside the family. You know, it's interesting.
You just kind of said a trigger word here, and I don't know if we've intentionally been avoiding the topic, but maybe I'll ask the question here. You said Facebook. I feel like Facebook is a relatively looming topic in terms of the hobby. I think there's
Sure. Well, we can talk about it. I don't care.
yeah, let's talk
I wasn't
about
trying to avoid it.
Facebook,
I
the
just,
good, the bad, the ugly of Facebook and Civil War reenacting.
yeah, I think Facebook, like all things, can be used for very good things. And it can be used to spread infinite amount of knowledge and positivity and information. That's the only
Yeah.
reason I joined Facebook back about not 10 years ago, was so that I could communicate with my group that was now increasingly on Facebook. That's the
Yeah.
only reason I joined it, because I was a captain and I wanted to make sure I could communicate.
That's
But
pretty much all I use. I think even on my personal Facebook page, I have a disclaimer. I said realistically, this is mostly for Civil War stuff.
right.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I
because
use it for Civil War and to post stuff about my son. That's it. But it is, I think, a black hole of bad stuff as well, both from the mainstream element and the more campaigner element. I think it's, they don't like each other, and I get where that comes from, but I also don't think that we're going to change the hearts and minds of other reenactors by denigrating them either.
I don't know if you can change hearts and minds just via the internet in general. I think one of the problems with it, and I know this is all like meta cyberbullying stuff, but like people feel empowered to type stuff that they wouldn't otherwise say to someone because
Right.
they know they hit send, they can close their screen, walk away. You could, and you don't see the effect of people, like the effect that it has on people. On the flip side, I've seen some stuff, and once in a while there'll be something that seems negative, or I'll feel like it hits home, but then I do some self-reflection and realize like, oh, this could apply to me. Maybe I need to look at myself in the mirror and do something. You know, I've made some impression changes. I've done some extra research because I've seen some nasty Facebook comments too. But for the most part now, I don't know, I think it keeps me accountable too. Everything I post on Facebook, if I feel comfortable subjecting to the eyes of the public these days. But I also think that a lot of people take it too far, don't know where the line is, and
I think
Like,
it's hard to gauge intent too on a Facebook
right.
post. It's, you know, and the only thing you can go on is the words and the subjective words that somebody, or the objective words that somebody writes. And so if they're putting it out there as a, hey, you know, you put this impression out there, you should look at these things to improve, or, you know, these things could be, make it better, versus, you know, saying that the person's an idiot and doesn't know anything. You know, that doesn't further the goal of what we're trying to do, and that's teach people and to be better. I don't know. What do you think, Dylan?
I just think if it's unwarranted, then leave it at home. Just keep it to your own group chats. I mean, here's the thing, like we're all, yeah, there's people that are in this to try to learn and do better, and then there's people that are just in it to be like, I'm so much better than everybody else that does this, and they all need to see that. And that's one thing that I think we could all try to get away from. Like it's easy when you see someone post on Facebook like a obviously glaringly bad impression and have no clue about it. Like, yeah, for most people, the first thing you want to do is get on there and just be like, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. But why? Why is that what you want to do? Or even if someone doesn't post something and then you're just like, I'm just gonna make a PSA, like, hey, if you're doing Reb reenacting, you should look like this. Why? Why do you gotta feel like you're the one that's uh out there trying to save everybody in this hobby? Like, why don't you just wait until somebody comes to you for help? And I think just taking a step back and being like helping those who come for it is way better than going after people to try to change minds. That's my whole standpoint on it. I think Facebook is great for event planning. Like we haven't had, like, events started to die down a little bit in like the mid 2000s after like the big boom of the late 90s. You have all this downtime, but then events start getting bigger and bigger. And I think a lot of that has to do with Facebook being able to connect all these people and getting event pages organized and getting groups organized to be able to make travel plans. And all of that is really great and really, really helpful for the hobby.
But what it's also done is it's fragmentized the hobby, I also think, because now you can go be a member of 14 different Facebook groups, and you really don't have, a lot of reenactors don't have a home unit per se. And that's maybe okay. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's changed the hobby to an extent where most, I would say most uh, authentic reenactors, and maybe I'm misspeaking, but don't have a quote unquote, you know, unit that they portray on a regular basis. They more or less are part of a group that portrays a lot of different units, which may be a good thing.
I
Well,
would
that's my
say,
thing with it is I think that you're just trading this one mentality for kind of the same thing, just on the flip side of it. So instead of all of us coming together and being like, hey, this is a cool event, let's all do this event, it's, oh, I'm only doing events that this group does. Even then, that's the same thing as, oh, I'm only doing stuff that the Second Florida is doing. And if
Yeah.
you're,
yeah,
you can be in the same camp just looking better, and it's not any more helpful to the hobby, I feel like.
I think too, one thing is, if I could sum it up, you guys can still hear me, right? My
Yeah.
headphones just okay. Um, so I think the hobby has shifted from a unit-based hobby to an event-based hobby, because back in the day, the big advantage of units was that they were locally established. So you would go and join a unit that was local to you because it was easier to communicate, because you all had same area code. You would do the same circuit of local events, and then you would band together and travel nationally. This is for people that don't have the privilege of living near original Civil War battlefields. But then nowadays you do it events because everyone's got busy schedules, conflicting things, 97 different impressions, so you can do whatever you want, and it's really more about what fits your schedule, what fits your philosophy on reenacting. Some people I know now are morally opposed to doing battle scenarios, and some people are not, and some people will only do battle scenarios, and you have this whole thing. So I think that's kind of been a driving factor more, and units have kind of fallen off because events are nationally based. I mean, Dylan and me and Ben and Chris Brezovoy, who all live in very, very different parts of the country, go to the same events and fall in the same companies because we know each other, we like each other, we have similar philosophies, personalities, and we
Yeah.
don't need that local basis as much as we might have used to back before the internet, back when reenacting was a bigger
That's
thing.
something I would agree with you with, and I was kind of going to get into. I think really the best way to go about it from a personal standpoint nowadays is to find a group of guys that you like, and you join, you make a mess together. And a mess group is, for those of you that might not be privy, a mess group is a group of guys that would come together and help carry mess equipment and cook together and basically just form a little gang inside the company. Taking that and then deciding as a mess, like, hey, what events do we want to go do? Where do we want to go? That is where you're going to find, I feel like, the most personal enjoyment in this hobby out of anywhere, because having like now running a group back here and then also, going to bigger organizations events back east, it's really become sort of the same thing of like, either you only do our events or you're, a conspirator, you're a mainstreamer, you get all this stuff thrown at you, and it's just so ridiculous. I think it's really the best way you could go about it is just look out for you and your friends.
The hobby has become, I think what I'm hearing is we've become free agents.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's how I feel, is more of a, just from a personal standpoint, a more enjoyable way to go about it, because you just exclude yourself automatically from politics, from drama, from organizational problems. But
And a
that
lot of
being
the other thing, the other thing I found is the diminishment of the umbrella organizations that were so prevalent in my early years, battalions, brigades, divisions, like the first Confederate division out west, that was a division of men, 3,000 or 4,000 men. Okay. And when they would take the field at Shiloh or Chickamauga or Franklin, they had a division of men. And so you belonged to a battalion within that division. And, you had a lot of unit pride, I guess, in that. And so all of those umbrella organizations that used to be thriving, they're gone. The Western Division, the Western Brigade, the First Confederate Division. I think the ANV is still around. I think some vestiges of Longstreet still around.
Yeah.
But again, these rather mainstream umbrella organizations are gone, and so there's been no subsequent organizations to swallow those up and carry on, which has left us with a void of, I think, leadership at the very top, where we don't know where to go. So it's like, oh, next year is the whatever, we're going to go because it sounds cool. May not be on the anniversary date, probably isn't, but because it sounds cool, we're going to try to go do that event. But back in the day, there was certainly more of a calendar, and it's a year that ends in 8 or 3, it's going to be Gettysburg, or 9 or 4 is going to be, Wilderness.
You also seem to have a lack nowadays of, so back in the day, these events were being put on by non-reenactors. Like you'd have local historical societies putting on events, battlefield, so I'm trying to think, these were organizations that were putting on events and inviting reenactors. And now what you have is that a lot of those organizations are no longer putting on events. So the people that want events to happen are reenactors. And because reenactors are putting on events, they're putting on events that are appealing to their brand of reenacting.
Yeah.
And that's one thing. So it's now even events aren't being put on the same way. I mean, I can think of a few examples. Perryville State Park still does the Perryville reenactment that Ben and I went to last year. And it was, here's the event, and then reenactors came. But for Wilderness next year, the I think it's a 501c that's putting on the Wilderness event is made up entirely of reenactors that are going to be participating in the event. And I mean, there's pros and cons, of course, to all of that, but I think that definitely has an effect, because then, you'd have, for the 135th Gettysburg, you would have all of these battalion commanders that did not get along, hate each other, but they'd all go to Gettysburg because it was Gettysburg. But now you have, oh, well, James Smith is putting on this event, and because James Smith and my captain got into a fight in 2006, we can't support anything that James Smith puts on as an event, and you alienate people in a different way. So,
and we don't have enough. The problem is today we don't have enough men
right. We can't afford to do that. I think
can't afford it.
And I think too, and this is my personal opinion, and it may be controversial, I think we're at a point where there are too many events for the number of reenactors. And I think we could afford to return to, all right, this is 1864. Let's do a big 1864 event, whether it be Wilderness or Petersburg or Kennesaw Mountain, but only focus on one or two and really try to concentrate everyone that we have in the hobby at this big event and try to get them there. I think that would do a lot
more.
more.
At the end of the day is you're not going to please everyone.
Right.
No matter what you do, not everybody's going to be happy about it. And I think as a hobby, we all just need to get to a certain point where, like, okay, what are you willing to tolerate and what are you willing to not tolerate? And then have a certain organization that puts on, like, okay, for all of those that are willing to tolerate this, here's our event schedule. And then for all those who aren't willing to tolerate it, here's our event schedule. And try to work those two groups together to where you can have an unlimited schedule that doesn't conflict with each other, and then everybody can handpick. I want to go to that one. I want to go to that one. I want to go to that one.
I have another controversial argument. I don't know if, but I think too that the more mainstream in terms of the narrative of the war an event is, the better chance it has of succeeding because people have impressions for it. So something like an ANV event or an ANV versus Army of Potomac event or an Atlanta campaign event, in my opinion, has a better chance of drawing more people than someone's specific niche interest of like a small battle that happened in some random part of the country that's not really associated with the mainstream narrative of the war. Now, that's not to say that it's not cool and that you can't do cool impressions and everything, but
right.
Most people have a Columbus Depot, have a Richmond Depot, and can do those events. I personally have no interest or can't afford to go buy a brand new impression head to toe to be able to portray Bleeding Kansas. No offense to those that are very into Bleeding Kansas, but it's not my niche. But also, it's not, I would say it's not a majority of people's niche to be able to do something like that. So I think too, when planning events, the closer to a mainstream narrative event you are, the higher chance you have of pulling more people.
Mainstream being like just a well-known unit,
Well-known battle
well-represented
in campaign. So
something,
something involving the major armies of the most well-known armies of the war: Army of Northern Virginia, Army of Potomac, Army of Tennessee, the Western Federal Army. You know,
right.
honestly,
You can be 100% detail oriented while still sticking
exactly
with the basics. That's the thing, is you
you
can
can
take
do a Gettysburg event that's really well organized with really good impressions, but I feel like there's this kind of taboo about it that some even authentic reenactors, they don't want to touch Gettysburg because it's too mainstream narrative of the war. But really, it should be the one that everyone focuses on because it's the one that's going to pull the most numbers of people.
And it's the one that we can probably do the best because we have the most research on it.
Right.
Exactly. That's like, how could you want to get away from what you have information on and go looking for like this obscure thing that you might not have all the details on? And that's when I question, like, is it just so that you can have more leeway and like be like, well, we didn't know 100% one way or the other, or is it just like I don't understand what it is.
I would love to see well, here we'll do this. Then we should probably put a bow.
We're almost an hour and a half.
But let me ask you this. So what is your dream scenario? Well, first of all, not two questions. Quick rapid fire. One thing you could change about the hobby to make it better. Go, Dylan.
I'd say getting away from these public locations and getting events put more onto private property and inviting spectators out, just to get away from these battlefields that are on parks and with playgrounds and stuff nearby and stuff like that. Just a little bit more focus on where the event was happening, because like a lot of events here in California, there's no like theme, like we are reenacting this battle. It's just a Civil War reenactment, and I think that that would help.
Okay, Ben.
I think on an individual level, for every reenactor to be a few steps ahead of where they are in terms of being a public educator and ambassador of the Civil War to mainstream culture, in terms of just, I think people could do a better job telling the story of the Civil War.
And, okay, and I'm going to say hats. Okay, I'm tired of the crushables. You don't need to get your Union slouch hat or your Confederate slouch hat at Walmart, okay, or Meijer, or anywhere else. I don't want to see it anymore. No more crushables.
Define crushable quickly.
Crushable is a modern synthetic wool synthetic hat that you can literally crush up and it bounces right back. It's like an Outback hat that you would wear. You see middle-aged boomers wearing them, on the golf course or on the beach. And they're basically shaped like a Crocodile Dundee type
Oh, good
hat.
Lord.
But It's not,
Often seen with a feather of some.
and we have a million of them in the Midwest, and I want them out. I want them done. No more crushables. Say no to crushables. Okay.
Friends don't
Next
let
question.
friends wear crushables.
That friends don't let friends wear crushables. I hate them. It's my biggest pet peeve. And if everybody got a correct hat, the hobby would be infinitely more authentic. Okay. Last question. Your dream scenario. You've got 1,000 reenactors. Okay. You can divide them up however you want. 1,000 reenactors. What is your dream scenario with battle, whatever you want? And how do you break it up? Dylan, go.
1,000 guys, any impression I want. Well, I'm going to take that 1,000 guys and I am going to go into the forest, and it's going to be basically just a regiment sized skirmish through the woods so that you couldn't see exactly how many guys, and it would be recreating a certain section of the fighting either at like Gaines Mill or Malvern Hill or right around there, just in the 7 days campaign, because I love that impression. If I could have 500 dudes in frock coats and running around with 1816s, that's cool to me. So I'm gonna do something along the lines of like a Gaines Mill impression, and scattered enough through the woods so that you couldn't really tell how many people were there.
So you would do a battle reenactment, or you just do a living history?
It would be like they used to call them tacticals back in the day. So you would march in, everybody, you wouldn't see the enemy, you march in, and then at some point fighting just kicks off, and then you have orders coming in, and it's a full-blown on contact battle where you're actively maneuvering and looking for the enemy.
Hey, Flower Day.
With 1,000 guys and appropriate equipment, I would have to say bombardment of Fort Sumter in April of 1861 would be cool. It's just a nonstop cannonade from like 4 a.m. onwards. Everyone in
no wilderness or Spotsylvania for you?
With 1,000? No.
Yeah.
I mean, my dream scenario is a 10,000 person Spotsylvania or Petersburg scenario, but I would say with 1,000, trying to recreate 1-to-1, I think you could get a couple of the garrisons in Charleston Harbor and Fort Sumter and all the Columbiads and cannons and stuff firing. So
I'm gonna go with first day of Gettysburg, Archer crossing Willoughby Run and engaging Iron Brigade in Herbst Woods.
Nice.
And the flanking of Archer and kind of the routing. I think that would be a really cool scenario. I divide it probably roughly I'd probably go 60-40 on the Fed side, Archer 400 guys, and I'd have them, slowly drive the skirmishers back across Willoughby Run, I'd like to find a gully with a creek and the woods and do that scenario. I think you could do some really cool impressions with it. Archer's Brigade and the Iron Brigade.
With 1,000 guys, I'm surprised you didn't say Port Royal Sound or Port Royal Ferry. And
we'll do that. We'll do that battle someday. But it's.
I got a question for Flower Day on his dream impression. Then, so does that mean it has to be on original ground?
I absolutely 100% wake up everyone in Charleston, South Carolina.
There you go.
Yes. That would be my dream event would be sitting in Fort Moultrie for 24 hours pulling the string on a cannon.
I did not see that one coming, but okay, interesting.
Have you been to Charleston, Quina? It's my favorite city I've ever been to in the country.
There are 3 that I need to get to yet: Vicksburg, Andersonville, and Charleston.
Wait, so that means that I've been to a Civil War site that Ben Quina has not been to. That's something I did not see coming.
Not seen the beginning of the war.
I've not seen Fort Sumter.
Nope.
Interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, I've never been there either.
It makes a little more sense being from California and not having written a book about South Carolina troops, but interesting. We should go down to Charleston. and Columbia and hit the research room or the the relic room, and then go to Charleston and do Fort Sumter. I think that'd be a really cool trip.
Well, gentlemen, I think we'll call it there. Thank you for your Ben, if you want to take the recording button there, but we want to thank everybody
right.
for subscribing and liking. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and obviously let us know if you have a topic you want us to address and questions you want to answer. We'll be happy to do it. So on behalf of Johnston guy, I see that on his interesting old retreat and the Overland campaign, now Fort Sumter guru, and myself will sign off. Thank you, everyone.